Part 2. How Nietzsche Wins. Why does God let people go through the stupid years? John Erickson was telling me in deprecating tones. The story of what he calls his stupid years. The time spent turning his back on the church and looking for a more sophisticated creed to live by. It is a familiar trajectory traveled by many young adults. I grew up in a devout, church-going, King James Bible Southern Baptist home in West Texas, John told me. But during my senior year in high school, I began reading Darwin and Freud. I immersed myself in the French poets, like Rembrandt and other decadents. When I asked questions about these secular ideas, the answer seemed to be that good Baptists didn't ask those questions. That did not satisfy me. Coming of age in the 1960s counterculture, John was attracted by his heady idealism. He was morally outraged by the more than 50,000 dead Americans in Vietnam, while, as he saw it, the church wrapped itself in the flag. As a Southerner, John was also repulsed by the church's historical role in slavery and racial oppression. He veered left in his politics and his theology, grew his hair long, and joined protest marches against racism and the Vietnam War. After college, John was awarded a Rockefeller Fellowship to attend Harvard Divinity School. There, he studied under the leading liberal luminaries of the day, such as H. Richard Niebuhr and Harvey Cox. Also teaching at Harvard at the time was Joseph Fletcher, author of Situation Ethics, a book that alienated students from the idea that there are unyielding principles of right and wrong. For students like John, it seemed that Fletcher had achieved an intellectual tour de force. He had put a scholarly gloss on what for centuries had been regarded as mere adolescent fantasy, that we are free to make up the rules as we go along and then call it Christian. It was not until John was about to graduate when he finally encountered a challenge to his theological liberalism, not by reading the Bible, but by reading Nietzsche. Vociferous atheist. The turnaround began when John wrote a paper on Nietzsche for one of his courses. I knew that Nietzsche was a vociferous atheist and an enemy of the Christian faith, but I rather enjoyed watching him throw jabs in the face of the flabby, gaseous Christianity. I figured it might be fun to spar a few rounds with him in my term paper. But the sparring match turned into a rout. To John's surprise, he found himself agreeing with much of Nietzsche's scathing critics of the white-bread culture Christianity so common in the West. Nietzsche denounced religion that had degenerated into sheep-like bourgeois respectability. I submitted my essay and made an appointment with the professor to discuss it, John told me. I couldn't even look him in the eye. Looking down, I said, Nietzsche won. I could not answer his arguments. You might expect a professor at the prominent divinity school to offer a robust counter-challenge to one of history's most notorious atheists. But to John's astonishment, the professor had nothing to offer except an A- on the paper. Years later, John came to regret the years that he had spent captivated by Nietzsche's atheism and nihilism. As a rebellious college student, he had found it all too easy to flog the organized church for its failings, while ignoring Christianity's positive contributions. John eventually discovered that many of the freedoms and human rights enjoyed in the West are fruits of its Christian heritage, that modern science is largely a product of the biblically inspired concept of the laws of nature. The just war doctrine developed in the medieval theologians did much to bring an end to the unlimited slaughter, rape, looting, and enslavement. That a host of moral ideals from anti-slavery to women's rights have their roots in Christianity. As students, we took all of this for granted, like oxygen in a lecture hall, and we heaped harsh arguments on the Christian West, John recalled. But we rarely asked, compared to what? The what was always from the utopian ideal. But utopian ideals have not fared so well. In the 20th century, secular utopianism idealists presided over the extermination of 100 million people, killed for a higher good by the apostles of Darwin, Marx, and Nietzsche. History has never produced a more efficient set of butchers. John came to wish his Harvard professor had been a lot tougher on their students' faddish nihilism. My professor should not have let me off so easy. She should not have allowed me to walk out of the office thinking that Nietzsche had obliterated 1900 years of Christian intellectual and moral accomplishment. He should have said something like this: Nietzsche was a brilliant, tormented genius who gave us the blueprint for spiritual disintegration and hell on earth. He beat you up because you're weak, rebellious, and ignorant. Worse, you're proud of it. Take your paper and write it again. In the end, John grew disillusioned enough to pack his bags and leave Harvard, move back to West Texas, where he reconnected with his family and his roots. Over the years, he rethought his theology and became a committed Christian. Today, he is a highly successful children's writer, author of a much-loved Hank the Cowdog series. Have it your way. Why does God allow people to go through what John Erickson calls the stupid years? To answer that, we must listen again to the message of Romans 1. The text repeats a poignant phrase that speaks volumes. God gave them up, gave them up, gave them up. Romans 1:24, 26, and 28. The phrase does not mean God gives up on people, just the opposite. It means he tries to get through to them by allowing them to play out the negative consequences of their idolatrous choices. This divine strategy is apparent throughout Scripture. When the ancient Israelites turned to idols, God said, "So I let them follow their own stubborn desires, living according to their own ideas." Psalms 81:12. Similarly, in the Song of Moses, God said, "I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end will be." Deuteronomy 32:20. In the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the word for see means to show, point out, exhibit, teach, demonstrate, and make known. Clearly, God's purpose is to reach out and communicate. In essence, God is saying, okay, have it your way, and see for yourself how destructive it is. This strategy has obvious parallels in everyday life. Parents sometimes have to allow the children to make bad choices and suffer the consequences. Teachers may have to let students fail due to bad study habits. Counselors know that addicts have to hit bottom before they are willing to change. In the same way, God gives people up so they will perceive the harmful consequences of their idols. From verse 26 to the end of the chapter, Romans 1 illustrates those consequences with a long list of destructive and self-destructive behavior. God uses these negative experiences to press people to the point of decision. Will they continue worshiping a counterfeit God that is destroying them, or will they repent and turn to the true God? Principle number 2. Identify the idol's reductionism. Why do idols invariably lead to destructive behavior? What is the connection? The link is that idols always lead to a lower view of human life. Romans 1, the connection is captured in the word exchange. They exchange the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Romans 1:23. When a worldview exchanges the Creator for something in creation, it will also exchange a high view of humans made in God's image for a lower view of humans made in the image of something in creation. Humans are not self-existent, self-sufficient, or self-defining. They did not create themselves. They are finite, dependent, contingent beings. As a result, they will always look inside themselves for their ultimate identity and meaning. They will define human nature by its relationship to the divine, however they define divinity. Those who do not get their identity from a transcendent creator will get it from something in creation. We could say that every concept of humanity is created in the image of some God, and because that divinity will always be lower than the biblical God, its view of humanity will also be lower. Those who dishonor God will dishonor those made in God's image. Those who create idols eventually become like them. Psalms 115:8. In philosophical terms, this is called reductionism, the process of reducing a something from a higher, more complex level of reality to a lower, simpler, less complex level. When an idol absolutizes some part of creation, everything else must be explained in terms of that one limited part, pulled down to that level, measured against that one yardstick, reduced to that lowest common denominator. Principle number 1 gave us the first step in engaging any non-biblical worldview: identify its idol. And now we move to the principle number 2, identify its reductionism. When God gives people up to their idols, the result is always a reductionistic view of humanity, which ultimately unleashes harmful and destructive behavior. When we reduce people to anything less than fully human, we will treat them as less than fully human. When we define God as a something instead of a someone, we will tend to treat humans as somethings too. Dehumanize thy neighbor. It may be easier to recognize the reductionism by starting on a personal level. Consider the idols that many of us live for. Do you live for financial success? Is that the most important goal in your life? If so, you will evaluate everything actively by its economic payoff. You will size up other people by asking whether they are useful for advancing your economic interests. Your outlook on life will be one-dimensional and utilitarian. Or is the most important thing in your life your relationships, your physical appearance, your professional accomplishments? No matter what your idol is, you will feel pressure to measure every part of your life by that yardstick. An idol always leads to a reductionistic attitude that dehumanizes others and justifies using them for your own agenda. Reductionism is often signaled by the phrase, nothing but. Think of some examples from everyday conversations. Haven't we all heard people say that religion is nothing but an expression of psychological need, a projection of a father figure in the sky, a myth invented by primitive people to assuage their fear of natural forces? The typical college course or television science program, a reductionistic theory of religion, is simply assumed without argument. Or haven't we all heard that love is really nothing but a product of chemical reactions? Current theories in neuroscience convey the impression that love can be reduced to neurotransmitters and circuits in the brain. A Wall Street Journal article suggests that Valentine's Day cards should not feature hearts, but images of squishy gray blob, the brain. And instead of saying, I love you, the knowledgeable lover would say, darling, dopamine floods my caudate nucleus every time I look at you. Haven't we all met cynics who insist that morality is nothing but self-interest in disguise? In ancient Greek, the sophists argued that people do what serves their own advantage, and afterward invent a moral code to justify their behavior. Today, an updated version of sophism is taking the college classroom by storm, a theory called evolutionary psychology. It claims that altruistic behavior has been programmed into our genes by natural selection because of its survival value. We are kind to others only so that they will be kind to us in turn. Reciprocal altruism. Or we will be kind to those who share our gene pool because we have a vested biological interest in passing our own genes on to the next generation. Kin altruism. Evolutionary psychology reduces all human behavior to masked self-interest. In practice, people often find ways to avoid the reductionistic implications of their worldviews. Because humans are made in God's image, they often do treat others with dignity and respect. They engage in humanitarian projects and advocate for human rights. The problem is that non-biblical world views provide no logical basis for such altruistic behavior. For example, the late Richard Rorty was revered as a philosopher of democracy, yet he wrote, "I would not know how to justify or defend social democracy," in a large philosophical way. He was acknowledging that he had no basis for his own highest ideals. In evangelism, it can often be effective to walk people through the implications of their worldview to show that it provides no basis for their own highest moral and humanitarian ideals. The science of cheating. Reductionism is the key to explaining why idols lead to immoral behavior, why Romans 1 ends with a list of destructive and self-destructive behavior. When we dehumanize people in our thinking, we will eventually mistreat, oppress, abuse, and exploit them in our actions. The connection between thinking and behavior has even been investigated scientifically. An article in Scientific American describes an ingenious series of studies designed to test the practical consequences of holding the philosophy of materialism, with its corollary that humans have no free will. A group of enterprising researchers decided to test whether such a reductionistic view of humanity has any impact on moral behavior. The results showed a clear yes. One experiment involves a quiz designed to make it easy to cheat. Some participants were randomly assigned to what was called a determinism condition. They were asked to read statements such as, "A belief in free will contradicts the known fact that the universe is governed by lawful principles of science." Other participants were randomly assigned to what was called a free will condition. They read statements such as, "Avoiding temptation requires that I exert my free will." Which group of participants cheated more on the quiz? The determinism group, whose members were encouraged to think they had no capacity for moral choice, and thus no moral responsibility. By contrast, the free will group, whose members were primed to exert their moral will, was less likely to cheat. Another experiment involved managing money. Once again, the determinism group was more likely to steal money. Scientific American summarizes one of the most striking findings to emerge recently in the science of free will is that when people believe, or are led to believe, that free will is just an illusion, they tend to become more antisocial. When a person accepts materialism as a life philosophy, its effects do not stay neatly contained within the mental realm. It leads to destructive personal behavior and harmful public consequences. In these experiments, science is catching up with what Paul said 2 millennia ago. Your worldview affects how you treat others. A reductionistic worldview leads to destructive behavior. Those who dishonor God will end up dishonoring themselves and others. The psychology of suppression. Given the negative consequences of a reductionistic worldview, you might wonder why anyone would adopt one. What's the appeal? Paul gives a clue. Recall that human nature is a part of general revelation, giving evidence for God. The existence of being with the capacity to reason, love, plan, and choose is evidence that the first cause that created them must have at least these same capacities. The cause must be sufficient to produce the effect. The origin of personal beings is explained by a personal being. How do sinful, fallen humans seek to avoid that conclusion? Paul says they suppress the truth, Romans 1:18. That's what reductionism accomplishes. It denies one or more dimensions of human nature, so that the evidence from human nature no longer points as clearly to the biblical God. If reductionism is like trying to stuff all of reality into a box, we could say the problem is that the box is always too small. Idols deify some part of the created order, but no matter which part they choose, a part is still too limited to explain the whole. The universe is too complex and multidimensional to fit into a box composed of just one part. Invariably, something will stick out. Something will not fit into its restricted conceptual categories. What then? Whatever does not fit into the box will be dismissed, devalued, or outright denied. Reductionistic thinking can be summarized as saying, if my worldview does not account for X, so much the worse for X. Idols are popular precisely because they can cut reality down to a size that can be stuffed into a box and controlled. They eliminate those dimensions of reality that would falsify the worldview. You can make any worldview appear successful simply by denying anything that does not fit into its box. To use the Bible's term, people suppress anything that threatens their favored worldview. In general revelation is evidence for God. If general revelation is evidence for God, then every substitute religion will have to deny that evidence. Yet, suppression creates a deep chasm, a dualism or dichotomy, sometimes in a theory, but always in practice. On one side of the chasm, there are things that fit inside the box, which are accepted as real and objective. On the other side are the things that stick out of the box, which are reduced to the status of subjective illusions or mental constructs. To switch metaphors, philosophers sometimes picture the dichotomy using the image of two stories in a building. Reductionists try to live in only one story. For example, materialists try to live strictly on the lower story, the material universe. They treat matter and energy as the only thing that are real, knowable, and objectively true. The upper story becomes a sort of attic where they toss everything that does not fit into the materialistic box: soul, spirit, mind, morality, freedom, love, and God. You might say that these things are stashed away in the attic in dusty old trunks labeled superstition and wishful thinking, and educated people know better. We can picture the two-story divide with a simple diagram. If you have read the works of Francis Schaeffer or my own earlier books, you will recognize this diagram. Materialists try to live in the lower story. The non-material world, subjective, superstitious, mental constructs, and the material world, objective constructs, noble facts. Just the thing with the line. Because people are made in God's image, however, in practice they cannot live strictly in one story. They cannot completely get rid of those troublesome old trunks in the attic. But that's jumping ahead to principle number 3, which argues that no one can live inside the limited box of an idol-based worldview. Before we make that argument, we need to see how widespread reductionism is. As there are many different idols, so there are many different forms of reductionism, and it is vital to hone our idol detectors to recognize them, because it is easier to identify the dehumanizing impact when worldviews are developed to their most logical conclusions. We will consider 2 of them in their most recent versions: materialism and postmodernism. Then we will identify the reductionism inherent in the two religions, pantheism and Islam. Finally, because negative consequences are especially visible when worldviews are expressed in public policy, we will end with 2 political theories. Crick. Nothing but a pack of neurons. In recent years, a radically reductionistic version of materialism has advanced called eliminative materialism. It goes beyond the traditional materialist claim that material conditions determine the mental world to the more surprising claim that the mental world does not exist, that all of our thoughts, convictions, desires, intentions, perceptions, and decisions are fictions. They are illusions produced by the underlying brain chemistry, with no causal impact for their own, like foam whipped up by the sea or sparks created by a machine. Our starting assumption as scientists ought to be that on some level, consciousness has to be an illusion, says Cambridge psychologist Nicholas Humphrey. The reason is obvious. If nothing in the physical world can have the features that consciousness seems to have, then consciousness cannot exist as a thing in the physical world. In his view, apparently, if something is not a thing in the physical world, then it cannot exist. But if consciousness is an illusion, then how is Humphreys conscious of that fact? And why should we trust the thinking of scientists who tell us there's no such thing as thinking? As one philosopher notes, eliminative materialism refutes itself, since even an illusion is the presence of an experience within someone's consciousness. Despite these logical contradictions, we will discuss in principle number 4, the same radical reductionism is held by several leading thinkers. Francis Crick, best known for cracking the DNA code, later undertook to disprove the existence of the soul or self. He writes, "You, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, and your ambitions, your sense of identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules." Playing off a line in Alice in Wonderland, he concludes, "You're nothing but a pack of neurons." In a similar vein, psychologist Daniel Wegner of Harvard argues that free will is an illusion and that all of our actions are really the effects of unconscious physical causes. His book is aptly titled The Illusion of Conscious Will. In an interview, he admits that free will is a very persistent illusion. It keeps coming back. Yet he treats it as nothing more than a magician's trick. Even though you know it's a trick, you get fooled every time. The feelings just don't go away. You might think that when a theory is contradicted by persistent experiences that just don't go away, that persistence should count as evidence against the theory. We will develop this argument in principle number 3. It strikes most people as extreme to claim humans have no free will or consciousness or personal identity. Why would anyone come up with a theory so contrary to a normal experience? The reasoning rests on a metaphor popular among cognitive scientists, that the brain is a computer. For example, Harvard neuroscientist Steven Pinker calls the human brain a complex machine for information processing or computation. Now, we know that computers work perfectly without being conscious. So why are we conscious? The reductionistic answer is we're not. The idea that there is an inner self that unifies our thoughts and experiences is an illusion. In Pinker's words, there is considerable evidence that the undefined self is a fiction. Where would such a fiction come from? The theory claims that natural selection has programmed it into our genes because it enables us to predict and control our environment more easily. For example, we can more easily predict that Sally will go to the refrigerator if we know she wants a drink and thinks a carton of milk is in the fridge. In reality, however, the theory says internal states such as wanting and thinking do not exist. Ordinary language is just a convenient shorthand that we use because an accurate account invoking the laws of physics that govern the neurons firing in Sally's brain would be impossibly complex. Deepest irrationality. We have to give eliminative materialism credit for being utterly logical. Having made an idol of matter, it rejects anything beyond the material realm. Yet not all materialists are happy with that outcome. They point to the obvious fact that we are conscious beings. Somehow, they say consciousness must emerge from matter. This view is called emergentism. Yet the claim that mental properties emerge from brain states is highly implausible. After all, mental states are not at all like physical states. A physical object is like a rose may be red and prickly, but your thought about the rose is neither red nor prickly. Physical objects are public. They can be observed by other people, but mental states, such as feelings of pain or joy, are private. They cannot be directly observed by anyone else. We explain physical states by invoking a general causal law, as in science. But we explain mental states by evoking personal intentions, desires, and choices. Finally, mental states are always about something, directed toward an object. You think about a person, you worry about a problem. But physical objects are not about anything, they just are. It appears that consciousness and matter differ in kind, qualitatively, not merely in degree, quantitatively. Therefore, to claim that consciousness somehow emerges from matter seems like trying to get something out of nothing, like pulling a rabbit from a hat. Philosopher Evan Fales calls it a mystery. Darwinian evolution implies that humans emerge through the blind operation of natural forces. It is mysterious how such forces could generate something non-physical. Philosopher Colin McGuinn treats it as akin to a miracle. We do not know how consciousness might have arisen by natural process from antecedently existing material things, he writes. One is tempted, however reluctantly, to turn to a divine assistance. It would take a supernatural magician to extract consciousness from matter. Resorting to a biblical analogy, McGinn asks, how did evolution convert water of biological tissue into the wine of consciousness? Philosopher Marc Bedeau says the idea of emergence is uncomfortably like magic. Thus, it will discomfort reasonable forms of materialism. More reasonable forms of materialism hold that if humans came from matter, that they consist solely of matter, and the mind is an illusion. Why do most people find it difficult to accept that reasonable conclusion? Because it runs counter to our most pressing everyday experience. In the words of philosopher Galen Strawson, the denial of consciousness is surely the strangest thing that has ever happened in the whole history of human thought. It shows that the power of human credulity is unlimited, that the capacity of human minds to be gripped by theory, by faith, is truly unbounded. It reveals the deepest irrationality of the human mind. This is a striking critique. Strawson is saying that eliminative materialism is a faith, one that is deeply irrational when measured against what we know by common sense experience. The 18th century philosopher Thomas Reid argued that such extreme logical consistency in the face of contrary facts is a form of insanity. When you allow yourself to be reasoned out of what you know by common sense, just because some philosophical system requires it, he wrote, we may call this metaphysical lunacy. After all, the goal of philosophy is to explain the facts of experience, not to deny them. Anything less is ducking the issue. The problem with reductionism is that instead of explaining things, it tries to explain them away. Outside the ivory tower, ordinary people are not interested in a worldview that spins out a logically coherent system and yet contradicts human experience. They are looking for a worldview that makes sense of the world we actually inhabit. They want one that explains the undeniable facts of human experience, not one that suppresses those facts for the sake of its own internal logical consistency. Besides the facts suppressed by materialism are expected exactly the things people care most about, the whole realm of conscious experience. Most of what makes life worth living consists of experiences: love, happiness, fulfillment, moral ideals, a sense of purpose, and so on. Finally, ordinary people are sensitive to the practical and moral consequences of worldviews. Radically reductionistic views of human person are not just harmless speculations, idle amusements for philosophers. What the dominant classes hold as true tends to shape social and political practice. If the elites hold a materialism that reduces humans to computers, then they will treat people like computers. Thinking will be reduced to computing and neuroelectrophysiology of the brain. People will be judged solely by how well they perform their assigned functions, and when they stop functioning, they will be tossed in the garbage heap with the other electronic trash. Revenge of the Romantics. In a typical university, this radical form of reductionism is likely to be held in the science department, where the expectation is that most professors embrace materialism. If you walk across the campus to the arts and the humanities buildings, however, you will find that most professors embrace postmodernism. In many ways, the two worldviews are diametrically opposed, yet both lead to the dehumanizing reductionism. For many people, the term postmodern seems somewhat archaic, but it is easier to understand if we trace how it developed. Its roots reach back to the Romantic movement touched on briefly in Principle Number 1. One of the heroes of Romanticism was Schopenhauer, who said, "Materialism is the philosophy of the subject who forgets to take account of himself." That is, a materialistic looks outward at the physical world as though that were solely reality, and forgets to look inward at the self. Yet the inner world of consciousness is equally part of the reality that worldviews are required to explain. The Romantics were not interested in recovering only the individual mind, however. They were enamored of Kant's idea of transcendental ego, or universal mind, with its godlike powers to create the world of experience. For many, it was a springboard to pantheism. Theologian Ian Barber says that for the Romantics, God is not the external creator of an impersonal machine, but a spirit pervading nature. The Romantics wanted to overthrow the Enlightenment image of the universe as a vast machine and replace it with an organic image, the universe as an organism. In their vision, explains Randall, the world was no machine, it was alive, and God was not its creator so much as its soul, its life. As we saw earlier, the philosophical label for this is idealism, the claim that the real causal power of in the universe is the mental realm of ideas. The Romantics wanted to knock down the idol of materialism. Ultimately, reality is material. So they proposed that the idol of idealism, ultimate reality, is mental. They wanted to counter worldviews that absolutize matter, so they absolutized the mind. Novelist Walker Percy says materialism stuffs everything into the box of things, while idealism stuffs everything into the mind box. Or, to return to the metaphor of the two stories in the building, each movement tries to live in one story. Western philosophy divides into two philosophical families: Romanticism, the box of the mind, and Enlightenment, the box of things. Each of these two streams grew into a richly interconnected network of philosophies, which today are called the Analytic and Continental traditions. The Analytic tradition traces its roots to the Enlightenment and tends to highlight science, reason, and facts. The Continental tradition traces its roots to the Romantic movement and seeks to defend the mind, meaning, and morality. Worldviews are not a scattershot of disconnected ideas. They tend to cluster in groups connected by family resemblances. When we learn each family's connecting themes, it will be easier to identify its form of reductionism. Emerson's Oversoul. When the Romantics reached out for conceptual tools to defend their spiritualized conception of the world, they revived Neoplatism, a version of idealism with roots in the 3rd century. University courses in philosophy often skip Neoplatism. I did not have a course on it until graduate school, yet it had a significant influence on Western history. As the name suggests, Neoplatism started out with Plato's thought, which was patched together with bits and pieces from other Greek schools of thought and then spiced with Eastern pantheism. From these diverse sources, Neoplatism crafted a big tent worldview. You might think of it as the New Age movement of the ancient world, combining elements from both East and West. The central tenet of Neoplatism was that the world is an emanation of a spiritual substance called the One or the Absolute. Like a fountain cascading down through multiple levels, the One emanated a descending series that flowed down through several levels, from spiritual entities to human beings, then to sentient creatures, animals, living things, plants, and finally material things like rocks. This is called the ladder of life, or the great chain of being. The goal of the spiritual life was to reascend the ladder, escape from matter, and reunite with the One. What attracted the Romantics to Neoplatonism was the idea that nature is permeated by soul or spirit. For the idealists, says Eagleton, the absolute served as a form of secularized divinity. This was not a personal God who thinks, feels, wills, and acts. It is a non-personal spiritual essence or substance. Ralph Waldo Emerson called it the oversoul, the soul of the whole, the eternal One. Hegel's evolutionary deity. Neoplatonism was given a novel twist by the philosopher Hegel, who added the concept of historical development or evolution. Until then, the ladder of life had been static. It was a fixed list or inventory of the things that exist in the universe. But with Hegel, the ladder became dynamic. To picture the change, you might think of the ladder tilting over to become an escalator, with the entire universe progressing upward through a series of stages. Hegel called this pantheistic deity the absolute spirit, or the universal mind. And because it was the soul of the world, it was said to evolve along with the world. What Hegel was offering was a spiritualized version of evolution. Nietzsche even said that without Hegel, there would have been no Darwin. The difference is that Hegel applied the concept of evolution not to biology, but to the world of ideas. His claim was that all our ideas, law, morality, religion, art, political ideals, result from the gradual actualization of the universal mind over the course of history. Everything is caught up in a vast historical process advancing towards a final perfect state. For many people, the law of historical progress functioned as a substitute for divine providence. When science seemed to take God out of the universe, men had to deify some natural force, like evolution, explains Randall. A goal-oriented version of evolution comforted people with the hope that every event has a reason, a purpose, within the upward progress of the universe as a whole. Hegel's philosophy is a form of historicism, the doctrine that all ideas are products of historical forces, that what is true is one stage of history will give way to a higher truth at the next stage. In essence, Hegel surveyed all the conflicting philosophies and worldviews, all the competing religious claims, all the warring camps and cultures, and proposed to overcome the strife by treating each one as a partial and relative truth in the upward progression of a mind, the evolution of consciousness. What is the logical flaw in historicism? It is self-refuting. It claims that every idea is a partial and relative truth, must include its own claim. Like every other evolving idea, it is relative, so its own moment in history, and therefore it's relative to its own moment in history, and therefore not true in any trans-historical sense. As philosopher John Passmore says, you cannot maintain as a timeless philosophical truth there are no timeless philosophical truths. Hegel avoided this devastating conclusion only by tactically making an exception for himself. He wrote as though he alone was mysteriously able to arise above the evolutionary process, as though he alone was capable of an objective, timeless, complete view of the entire historical process. But of course, by making an exception for himself, Hegel implied that there was one thing that his system did not cover, namely his own thinking. In this way, he introduced a logical inconsistency into his system. And of course, any inconsistency within a system of thought discredits it. Many worldviews are subject to the same logical flaw. We will probe it more deeply in principle number 4. Triumvirate of race, class, and gender. In our own day, we have progressed far beyond the Romantic era, yet the continental tradition continues to exert enormous influence. It moved from idealism through a series of successors, such as existentialism, which we will not take time to discuss. In recent decades, it has given birth to postmodernism. The tragic irony is that although Romanticism was embraced to counter Enlightenment reductionism, postmodernism has become equally reductionistic and inhumane. In everyday life, we encounter postmodernism most often in the form of political correctness, multiculturalism, identity politics, speech codes. Rules for the politically correct speech have become in most social institutions, schools, newspapers, law, politics. A Harvard professor complains that on many university campuses, students are muzzled by speech codes that would not pass the giggle test if challenged on First Amendment grounds. These rules define the accepted ways to speak about race, class, gender, ethnicity, sexual identity, and so on. Postmodernism virtually defines a person's identity in terms of the groups to which he or she belongs. How did we get from Hegel to postmodernism? For Hegel, the real actor in history is not the individual, but the absolute mind or spirit, which expresses itself through a community's laws, morality, language, social relationships, and so on. Hegel accepted Kant's idealism, in which the world is constituted by consciousness, but for him, it was a collective consciousness. As one philosopher explains, the absolute mind creates the world through the shared aspects of culture, society, and above all, through shared language. Indeed, for Hegel, individuals did not even have original ideas of their own. Their thoughts were merely expressions of the absolute mind. In his words, individuals are all the time the unconscious tools of the world mind at work within them. Over time, Hegel's pantheism was secularized, and his absolute spirit was reduced to a metaphor, the spirit of the age, the Zeitgeist. In German, Zeit means age, Geist means spirit. What remained, however, was the idea that individuals are unconscious tools of the Zeitgeist. They are not producers of culture so much as they are products of a particular culture. Individuals are shaped by the communities they belong to, each with its own shared perspective, values, habits, language, and forms of life. In our own day, this has led to the extreme conclusion that everyone's ideas are merely social constructions stitched together by cultural forces. Individuals are little more than mouthpieces for communities based on race, class, gender, ethnicity, and sexual identity. What is the idol here? Postmodernism absolutizes the forces of culture or community. Dewey called it the ideology of community. Truth has been redefined as a social construction, so that every community has its own view of truth, based on its own experience and perspective, which cannot be judged by anyone outside the community. One postmodern theological makes the claim in these words: there is no absolute truth. Rather, truth is relative to the community in which we participate. Rorty says the truth is merely intersubjective agreement among people within a particular community. Postmodernism is thus a form of anti-realism, the doctrine that reality depends for its character and possibility, even its existence in our minds. The term anti-realism was coined by Nietzsche to describe his own view, which he summed up in the slogan, "There are no facts, only interpretations." Or, as one postmodern writer puts it, reality has now become a mere bunch of desperate and changing interpretations, a shifting, loosely held coalition of points of view in continual debate with each other. If reality has shattered into classing interpretations, so has the concept of personal identity. Postmodernism says there is no unified self. Instead, the self is simply the locus of the shifting points of view absorbed by various interpretive communities, each defining its own truth. Recall that the Enlightenment treated the individual as a disembodied mind, capable of transcending time and space to archive a God's eye view. See principle number 1. In reaction, postmodernism tethers individual consciousnesses tightly to communities whose perspective is conditioned by history and geography. Even science, the golden calf of modernism, is not considered true in any universal sense. Like all other forms of knowledge, science is a social construction. Postmodernists agree with Nietzsche, who wrote, all that conformity to law, which suppresses us so much in the stars and in chemical processes, coincides at bottom with those properties which we bring to things. If science is just another creation of the human mind, why should it be granted any special status over other ways of thinking? If there is no objective or universal truth, then any claim to have objective truth will be treated as nothing but an attempt by one interpretive community to impose its own limited subjective perspective on everyone else. An act of oppression, a power grab. Roots of political correctness. Like other idols, postmodernism gets some things right. It has done good service in the countering of the lonely individual of Enlightenment's autonomous self. It rejects the modernist project of thinkers like Bacon and Descartes to start history over from scratch within the isolated individual consciousness. It denies that we can reach an infallible foundation for knowledge by direct intuition into the contents of the individual mind. In the process, postmodernists have debunked Enlightenment claims to neutral, timeless, value-free knowledge. They insist that real, living individuals always bring to the table a complex panoply of prior commitments, interests, goals, and ambitions, even in fields like science, where objectivity is the expected norm. And the same insight, however, was offered long ago by Christian thinkers. Scripture itself is replete with warnings that idolatry leads to a kind of spiritual and intellectual blindness. Romans 1 tells us that when we refuse to acknowledge God, our minds become futile and our hearts are darkened. Romans 1:21. Theologians call this the noetic effects of sin, from the Greek word nous, which, as we saw earlier, means not just the mind, but the core of our being. The Protestant reformers taught that when we turn away from God at the core, then everything we do is affected, including our thinking. We come to our desks or laboratories with a complex set of motivations and predispositions already in place, which predetermine, to some degree, what we accept as plausible or true. Far from being neutral blank slates, our minds are predisposed to interpret new data in light of the convictions we already hold, what we want to be true. Yet postmodernism typically goes further than its common sense biblical insight to the much more radical claim that there is no extra mental truth. It reduces truth claims to the social constructions, and it reduces individuals to puppets of social forces. The implication is that people hold certain ideas not because they have good reasons, but because they are black or white or man or woman, Asian or Hispanic or whatever. This is radically dehumanizing. It implies that individuals are powerless to rise above the communities to which they belong. It is a form of reductionism that dissolves individual identity into the group identity, and the list of group identities keeps growing. Harvard's Kennedy School of Politics recently announced that all incoming students will be required to take a mandatory power and privilege training that examines components of race, gender, socioeconomic class, sexual orientation, ability, religion, international status, and power differentials. At many universities, liberal arts departments no longer teach the classics, but immerse students in the contemporary works on radical and sexual politics. And if the classic books of literature and philosophy are taught, they are likely to include trigger warnings, an omnibus edition of Kant's 3 Critiques, including a warning label on the title page. This book is a product of its time and does not reflect the same values as it would if it were written today. Parents might wish to discuss with their children how views on race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, and interpersonal relationships have changed since this book was written before allowing them to read this classic work. The irony is that Kant had enormous influence on the development of the anti-realist concept of truth. But that's not what educators are concerned about. They're worried about Kant's violations of political correctness. Postmodernism is leagues away from the materialisms rampant in the science department, but it is equally dehumanizing. Materialism reduces humans to products of physical forces. Postmodernism reduces them to products of social forces. Whenever a philosophy absolutizes something less than God, no matter what it is, the result is reductionism, a lower view of the human person. Postmodernists themselves label their view anti-humanism, by which they mean the human subject has no power to transcend social or historical conditions, the zeitgeist. In that case, however, the individual can have no independent stance from which to critique the zeitgeist. As Dallas Willard points out, postmodernism hardly leaves you a logical leg to stand on to oppose the spirit of the age. By contrast, Christianity offers a transcendent truth, a perspective not bound by the spirit of the age. It liberates individuals to think critically about the prevailing ethos. The fall of postmodernism. I was speaking at an evangelical college when a student asked, "We live in a postmodern age when no one cares anymore about truth. How do we talk to people who are not persuaded by facts and reasons?" It's true that postmoderns may not be impressed by fact-based apologetics, but they can be reached by arguments using their own conceptual language. Start with their view of truth. Postmodernists reject any claim to a truth that is universal, objective, or eternal. They insist that everyone's perspective is situated within a context that is particular, local, and historically contingent. But of course, the same critique applies to postmodernists' own claims. They too are situated within a particular historical context. After all, where did postmodernism come from? As we have seen, it's an offshoot of modern European culture. It stems from Hegelian continental philosophy, with its notion that individuals are socially constituted by their communities and forms of life. Postmoderns often accuse Christians of being narrow and closed-minded, but postmodernism is itself confined within a particular strand of Western intellectual history. Thus, postmodernists are just as restricted by their own historical horizons as the more traditional people whom they tend to look down on, and they are just as exclusive as anyone else in insisting that their view captures the way things really are. In short, the same reasoning that postmodernists use to debunk traditional concepts of truth applies to their own views. Some postmodernists have updated Hegel's historicism by linking it to the science-based theories of evolution. An example is Rorty, who argues on the basis of Darwinian evolution that there are no eternal truths, that all our ideas are a product of time and chance. But His conclusion rests on the assumption that Darwinian evolution is true, in precisely the sense he denies that anything can be true. I was once invited on a radio program to debate a seminary professor who described himself as postmodern. My question was, why would a Christian want to embrace postmodernism? Granted, it deflates modernist claims that universal truth by showing that modernism is a limited, historically conditioned point of view. But then, so is postmodernism. As a Christian, why would I want to commit myself to any idea that is merely a social construction? The Bible describes idols as human inventions, the work of human hands. Psalms 115:4, 135:15. Their craftsmen are only human. Isaiah 44:11. Those who worship idols bow down to the work of their hands, to what their own fingers have made. Isaiah 2:8. Why would Christians want to build their lives on any idea that is a product of human thinking, the wisdom of the world, as 1 Corinthians 1:20 says? The human heart hungers for truth that is transcendent and eternal. God has set eternity in the human heart, says Ecclesiastes 3:11. The finite cannot reach to the infinite, so the only way it is possible to know eternal truth is if God has communicated to the human race, giving his own transcendent perspective. And that's exactly the earth-shaking claim that Christianity makes. The scripture is communication from God, giving us information about himself, the cosmos, and history. Even Christians typically take this concept too far too much for granted. For it amounts to the astonishing claim that we do have access to a God's eye view of the world, a perspective beyond merely human knowledge, a timeless and transcendent truth. Of course, our comprehension of that truth is never complete or exhaustive. Or understanding is filtered through our fallible, fallen human minds, influenced by our culture and circumstances. Yet, there are windows to transcendence. God's word in Scripture gives us access to truths that are not of human origin, as said in Galatians 1:11. Over against postmodern historicism and relativism, Christianity makes the liberating claims that humans have access to trans-historical truths because God himself has spoken. In a striking passage, Rorty admits that the very concept of objective truth is grounded in the Christian conviction that the universe was created by a person. The idea of a truth beyond human subjectivity, he writes, is a remnant of the idea that the world is a divine creation, the work of someone who himself spoke some language in which he described his own project. In other words, objective truth is possible only if the Creator has spoken to the human race, given us his eternal, transcendent perspective, not about matters of salvation only, but also about history and the cosmos. To adapt the titles of Schaeffer's books, it is not enough that God is there, it is also critical that he is not silent. Only if God has communicated the infinite reaching down to the finite is it possible to break free, no longer trapped in our individual minds as Enlightenment thinkers were, or trapped in a communal mind as postmodern thinkers are. A biblical apologetic strategy will equip you to help liberate those who have been taken captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy which depends on human tradition, as Colossians 2:8 says. It will teach you how to unmask the temporal idols and turn people toward eternal truth. Pantheism versus you. So far, we have traced two very different forms of reductionism, resulting from two widespread philosophies, materialism and postmodernism. A Romans 1 apologetic strategy also gives us tools to diagnose reductionism resulting from religion. Let's practice applying those tools in Eastern pantheism and Islam. Earlier, we learned that Romantic thinkers embraced a Western version of pantheism. So it is not surprising that they were also open to Eastern versions. In the late 19th century, Schopenhauer became the first philosopher to import full-blown Buddhism into the West. In our own day, the New Age movement has elevated Eastern religions to the status of Hollywood chic. Pantheism is typically summarized as the doctrine that God is the universe and the universe is God. Pan means all, and theism means God. So all is God. God is called the One or the All. The world is seen as a manifestation or emanation of the divine essence. Is this an idol? Obviously. Pantheists typically argue that the biblical teaching of transcendent God has alienated us from nature, that it has caused Western culture to rape and plunder the earth. If we cultivate a sense of spiritual oneness with nature, they claim, we will have a greater reverence for all life. Is that claim true? Not at all. The reason is that, like all idols, pantheism is reductionistic. It leads to a lower view of life. Whatever a worldview identifies as the divine becomes the lens through which it sees everything, the sieve it uses to sift out what is real. In pantheism, the divine is an underlying spiritual unity, the One. What slips through the sieve, then, is diversity, difference, individuality. In Hinduism, your individual identity is actually called Maya, which means illusion. It is regarded as the cause of evil, selfishness, greed, and war. The goal of meditation is to dissolve your sense of being a separate self by merging with the cosmic One, the undifferentiated all, like a drop of water dissipating into the ocean. In Buddhism, the word nirvana literally means to become extinguished. The loss of self is expressed in a poem by the Chinese poet Li Po. The poem is about the coming of evening, and it ends with these words: "We sit together, the mountain and I, until only the mountain remains." This poem is often quoted in books on meditation as a moving expression of our oneness with nature. But notice that in this oneness, the I is lost, dissolved into the rock of the mountainside. As a contemporary poet explains, the mountain represents the Eternal One. Watching this mountain of eternal presence long enough, in deep stillness you will find that you are nowhere to be seen. You are surprised to discover that everything you reflexively called me was never really there in the first place. The implicit message is that the individual self has so little value that it ought to dissolve into the One. For it was never really there in the first place. It was an illusion. Another reason pantheism leads to a low view of human life is that the divine is non-personal. In classic pantheism, the concept of the divine is not a deity who thinks, wills, feels, and acts. Instead, it is a non-personal, non-thinking, non-acting spiritual substratum underlying all things. A former Zen Buddhist who converted to Christianity explains that in pantheism, the divine is an unconscious, impersonal essence which may be called God, nature, and the absolute oneness. As a result, surprisingly, pantheism is not all that different from materialism. It is the flip side of the same coin. Materialism claims that everything consists of material stuff. Pantheism claims that everything consists of spiritual stuff. Both are non-personal. Thus, both fail to account for the personal dimensions of human nature, and what they cannot account for, they will suppress and ultimately deny. This is the reductionist pattern. Every idol-based worldview seeks to stuff all of reality into a box. Inevitably, however, something will stick out of the box. Something will fail to fit within its conceptual categories. Both materialism and pantheism define ultimate reality in non-personal terms, and therefore both fail to account for human personhood. Thus, they end up denying, segregating and devaluing the unique features of human persons. Humans are reduced to products of non-personal forces. The individual dissolves into the rock of the mountainside. Any system that begins with non-personal forces will in the end, suppress human personhood. It will reduce persons to components of a blind, unconscious matrix of being. Water cannot rise above its source. The puzzling question is why these worldviews are at all popular. After all, what we long for most of all is to be known and loved for who we are as unique persons, a longing that can be met only if the divine is a person. The God of Christianity does not erase our individual identity, but actually affirms it. He calls us to become ever more fully the unique individuals we were created to be. Contrary to Eastern mysticism, the goal is not to suppress our desires, but to direct them to what truly satisfies, to a passionate love relationship with the ultimate transcendent person. Islam versus human dignity. All the religions we have considered, whether Eastern or pagan, fit the diagnosis of Romans 1. They worship the created instead of the creator. They absolutize something immanent within the cosmos. Because their God is something lower than the biblical God, they lead to a lower view of the human person. As Principle 2 says, they lead to reductionism. The exceptions to this rule are the other monotheistic religions, Judaism and Islam, which share with Christianity a concept of a transcendent creator. They also accept at least some of the same scriptures. I'm going to leave Judaism aside because of its complex relationship with Christianity. Christians hold that doctrines such as the Trinity are found in the Old Testament, even taught more explicitly in the New Testament. That's why the gospel went to the Jew first, as Romans 1:16 says. The term Judeo-Christian emphasizes the many continuities and similarities. What about Islam? Today, Islam has become a powerful geopolitical force, and Christians are searching for better ways to understand it. Islam accepts segments of the Christian scripture as divinely revealed, the Hebrew Torah, the Psalms of David, and the Gospels. Nevertheless, its concept of God differs in important ways from the classic Christian theology, most obviously by rejecting the concept of the Trinity. The Quran teaches that Jesus is not divine, but only a messenger of Allah. Islamic scholar Sayyid Hossein Nasr writes, the Quran continuously emphasizes the unity and the oneness of God, and it can be said that the very raison d'etre of Islam is to assert in a final and categorical manner the oneness of God and the nothingness of all before the majesty of the One. Due to Islam's emphasis on the oneness of God, some scholars even maintain that it is closer to the pantheism of Neoplatonism and Hinduism than to Christianity. As a consequence, the Islamic concept of divinity is missing key elements of personhood. For example, consider the qualities associated with relationship. Only within a relationship can God express interpersonal attributes such as love, sympathy, intimacy, self-giving, and communication. Only between distinct persons can there be giving and taking, initiating and responding, sharing and self-revelation, union and communion. For God to be fully personal, then capable of love and community, there must be genuine plurality within the divine being itself. Historic Christian theology teaches that these interpersonal attributes were expressed from all eternity among the three persons of the Trinity. In this way, Christianity is able to maintain within the Godhead the highest concept of what it means to be a personal being. All sorts of people are fond of repeating the Christian statement that God is love, writes C.S. Lewis, but they seem not to notice the words God is love have no real meaning unless God contains at least two persons. Love is something that one person has for another person. If God is a single person, then before the world was made, he was not love. Or did he have the capacity for love? He had no way to exercise it, to fulfill his nature. He would need to create a world, in which case he would be dependent on creation, which is not the kind of deity taught by either Islam or Christianity. Only a God of love is fully personal. Thus, the Trinity is crucial for maintaining a fully personal concept of God. As theologian Robert Letham writes, only a God who is triune can be personal. A solitary monad cannot love, and since it cannot love, neither can it be a person. Therefore, it has no way to explain or even to maintain human personhood. Astonishingly, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy reports that Islam does not even have a concept of the person. There is no conceptual equivalent of the Western philosophical concept of a person in Arabic and in classic Islamic philosophy. This seems to confirm the importance of the specifically Christian origins of the term. If it is true that Islam lacks even a clear concept of the person, this would explain why it tends to be fatalistic, emphasizing sheer submission to the will of Allah. Islam means submission. As Udo Mittelmann explains, Islam is a religion of resignation. Allah made the world, and you must accept the way it interacts with you, even should it kill you. You are allowed no questions, no doubt, no individual responsibility. Negation of self is your salvation. This also explains why a great deal of Muslim worship consists of near mechanical rituals. Worshippers recite the Quran in unison, word for word, by memory, in the original Arabic. The word Quran means that which is recited. To quote Mittelmann again, its spirituality is repetitious and impersonal, not a chosen and deliberate love of God with all your heart, mind, and soul. Muslims are not even required to understand what they recite. Many are not Arabic and do not speak the language. A book by two Muslim authors says, "It is not uncommon to meet people who have a great deal of the text by heart, but have not the slightest understanding of the worldview that permeates it. But this is acceptable," says the author, "because in Islam, understanding is secondary to resuscitation and ritual." Thus, Islam proves the reductionist principle once again, that a lower view of God leads to a lower view of the value, status, and dignity of the human person. From secular idols to death. From secular idols to death camps. One of the most powerful ways to engage with seekers and skeptics is to help them identify their own idols. And idols are easier to recognize when lived out in practice, especially when they are incarnated in politics and public policy. We have applied principle number 2 to philosophies and religions. Now, let's show the impact of reductionism when fleshed out by two political theories, Nazism and communism. Both illustrate the dark and destructive power of idols. Western history is often retold in the form of a religious epic, says anthropologist Richard Schroeder. The Enlightenment story has its own version of Genesis, and the themes are well known. The world woke up from the slumber of the Dark Ages, finally got in touch with the truth, and became good about 300 years ago in Northern and Western Europe. This secular faith offers its own version of salvation. As people open their eyes, religion, equated with ignorance and superstition, That gave way to science, equated with facts and reason. For centuries, the Enlightenment myth was held up as the blueprint for progress and liberty. Yet, as a theory of history, Schroeder comments dryly, the story has had a predictive utility of approximately zero. For the rise of secularism did not lead to ever-increasing liberty. On the contrary, it turned the 20th century into the bloodbath of death and destruction. Most of the atrocities were perpetrated by regimes devoted to political ideologies such as National Socialism, Nazism, and Marxism, Communism. Historians have often wondered how such mind-staggering barbarianism could have emerged in modern civilized Europe. The answer lies in the power of idols. Nazi doctrine was organized around the idol of race. An individual's race, Aryan or Jewish or Slavic, was said to determine that person's views, character, and even worth. Communist ideology was organized around the idol of economic class. A person's economic class, capitalist or proletarian, was held to be the all-determining factor. As we have seen, in every idol-based worldview, some parts of creation will not fit into its box. Some facts of general revelation will be suppressed. But when idol-centered worldviews are applied in the political realm, there will be some people who do not fit in the state's prescribed box, and who will literally be suppressed and even killed. Under Nazism, those who did not fit into the prescribed box of race included Jews, Gypsies, Slavs, Serbs, Poles, Ukrainians, and others. They were transported to concentration camps where about 25 million died or were shot to death. Under communism, those who did not fit into the prescribed box of economic class included capitalists, kulaks, and others. They were subject to forced famines or to hard labor camps where an estimated 85 to 100 million died or were shot to death. Both regimes rounded up dissenting Christians. In World War II, these same false absolutes led to global conflict. As Gilson observed at the time, millions of men are starving and bleeding to death because 2 or 3 defied abstractions are now at war. For when gods fight among themselves, men have to die. The lesson is that idol-based ideologies are invariably dehumanizing, and if unchecked, they lead to repression, coercion, oppression, war, and violence. In the 20th century alone, they have taken far more lives and created more havoc than all the religiously motivated witch hunts, inquisitions, and wars of the previous centuries. Materialists are ready to worship their own jerry-built creations as though they were the absolute, writes Aldous Huxley. And this makes it possible for them to indulge their ugliest passions with a clear conscience and in the certainty that they are working for the highest good. The bloodshed and death camps produced by idolatrous ideologies were not a violation of their principles, as religious wars were violation of Christian principles. They were logically consistent outworkings of the worldview. Philosopher John Gray, though himself an atheist, writes that when atheism becomes a political project, the invariable result is an ersatz religion that can only be maintained by tyrannical means, by secret police and death camps. From liberators to despots. The study of worldviews is not merely a theoretical subject to be discussed hypothetically in the classroom. Idols have life and death consequences. When Romans 1 says God gives people up to the destructive impact of their idols, That does not mean only personal behavior. Worldviews are also incarnated in the classroom, the boardroom, the courtroom, the legislative chamber, and the theater of war. Modern totalitarianism illustrates Paul's teaching that those who do not know God will fall under the yoke of idols. They will be enslaved to those that by nature are not gods, says Galatians 4:8. When a group of famous ex-communists wrote a book about their disillusionment, they titled it The God That Failed. Historian Isaiah Berlin once observed that every philosophy offers a model of reality that promises to liberate people from error, but they almost invariably end by enslaving those very same people by failing to explain the whole of experience. They begin as liberators and end in some sort of despotism. To create a humane society, we must identify the idols that fail to explain the whole of experience, that lock people into partial, one-dimensional models of reality. The only basis for genuine human rights and dignity is a fully biblical worldview. Instead of absolutizing one piece of the puzzle, Christianity offers the entire puzzle with all the pieces in harmony, creating an image of enchanting beauty. It gives a far richer, fuller, more complex vision of reality than any other worldview. Christianity includes the valid insights of all other worldviews, while avoiding their weaknesses. More than is dreamed of in your philosophy. What is the common thread running through all the examples in this chapter? Religions and worldviews that deny the biblical God must treat something else as the ultimate reality, principle number 1. With the exception of the other monotheistic religions, they deify something inanimate within the cosmos. They absolutize some aspect of creation as the ultimate explainer. Then they reduce everything else to that single category, principle number 2. Reductionism is like trying to see the world through the single lens G.K. Chesterton called reductionism a mental prison, the prison of one thought. Whatever does not fit into that prison is denied and suppressed. The result is always a vision of the world that is narrower, poorer, darker, and less humane than the biblical picture. A worldview's concept of humanity cannot be higher than its concept of the divine. Romans 1 starts its teaching on idols by saying that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. There is probably nothing that modern people hate more than religion than talk of the wrath of God. It suggests a picture of an angry, vengeful deity. But the biblical concept of wrath often refers simply to God's implacable opposition to evil and injustice. It does not necessarily mean a catastrophic event like a lightning bolt from heaven. In fact, it does not necessarily mean divine intervention in human affairs at all. As we have seen in principle number 2, God's judgment often consists in giving people what they want and letting them experience the self-inflicted consequences of their choices. He allows them to choose ways of thinking and living that are self-destructive, tearing down the honor and dignity of others and themselves. I cannot think of a better description of reductionistic worldviews. When Romans 1 warns that idols lead to the behavior that is dishonoring, we often overlook the implication, namely, that the people are meant to honor others and themselves. As Thomas Jefferson writes, the text implies that there are proper ways for people to honor themselves, namely by accepting God's view of them. When people accept their status as image bearers of the Creator, placed in this world to fulfill His mandates, there is honor for all. But when they create God's substitutes and recast their self-understanding in the image of an idol, then there is dishonor and destruction for all. Our hearts should break for people whose worldviews are dark, dehumanizing, demeaning, and dishonoring to the human person. An opportunity is wide open to present Christianity as radically positive and humane. A biblical worldview does not divinize any aspect of creation or set up a false absolute. As a consequence, it does not lead to a reductionism that devalues or denies the other dimensions of creation. It does not have to shove the universe into a box and slice off whatever doesn't fit. It is not exclusive, but inclusive, affirming the goodness and reality of all God's diverse and multifaceted creation. Christianity agrees with Hamlet when he said to Horatio, "There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in your philosophy." Reductionistic worldviews insist that there are fewer things in heaven and earth. Living according to these worldviews is like living in a concrete bunker with no windows. Communicating a Christian worldview should be like inviting people to open the door and come out. Our message ought to express the joy of leading captives out of a small, cramped world into one that is expansive and liberating. We understand better now why Paul could stand before the Roman Empire and proclaim that he was not ashamed of the gospel. He was confident that Christianity is not only more convincing than any competing religion or worldview, but also more appealing. In Scripture, the phrase, "put to shame," does not usually mean be psychologically embarrassed. It means to trust in something that lets you down, that fails to come through. Let me not be put to shame. Let not my enemies exult over me. Psalms 25:2. Because the Lord God helps me, I know that I shall not be put to shame. Isaiah 57. So when Paul says he is not ashamed of the gospel, he is saying that the Christian worldview will not let you down. It will not disappoint you. Christianity fulfills the human hunger for a unified, integrated worldview to live by. It has the intellectual resources to provide a holistic, eternally consistent guide to life. Of course, being attractive does not mean the worldview is true. To test whether it is true or false, we need to move to principle number 3. When we ask whether an idea is true, typically what we mean is, does it fit into the world as we know it? Does it match up with the facts? In Principle 3, we'll see how Romans 1 outfits us with a powerful set of tools to test worldviews and uncover truth.